Welcome back to What America's Thinking. A recent WPA intelligence survey has Florida Governor Ron DeSantis coming out on top in a hypothetical 9-person GOP primary field, with 40% of Republican primary voters calling the Florida governor their top choice to win the party's 2024 White House bid. 31% call former President Donald Trump their top choice, with no other GOP figure receiving double digits.
Donald Trump and Nikki Haley are the only two people in this survey who have formally announced their presidential campaigns. But Governor Ron DeSantis is planning visits to 3 early presidential primary states in the next several weeks, including Iowa, Nevada, and New Hampshire. Joining us now to take a deeper dive into this survey is Chris Wilson, founder and CEO of WPA Intelligence. Chris, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Chris, just to start off, we have seen a number of polls out from Republican firms like yourself, like your own firm, as well as some nonpartisan national polls showing that this is, still President Trump's race to lose, especially from more of those national polls. What are we seeing in some of these early primary states like Iowa, like New Hampshire, where President Trump and Ron DeSantis, until these recently announced visits, they haven't spent a lot of time in those states yet?
Well, I think the first thing you have to look at with these is the methodology. And having done polling for presidential campaigns in the past, I always am fairly skeptical of media polls on it. And not because I think they're wrong. I just think they're talking to the wrong people. And to give you an example, you just mentioned Iowa and New Hampshire. And those are great examples because they're very different in how they vote. Iowa is a caucus state, so unless you turn out and vote in caucuses, you're not going to be counted. In 2008, there were 119,000 caucus goers that voted in the Republican caucus. In 2012, there was about 119,000. And then in 2016, there were 187,000. So you can see quickly how it rises up. So that should be your sample, is those who frequently vote in a caucus. In New Hampshire, independents can vote in either Republican or the Democrat primary. So those are going to be sampled. Then you have what are called closed primary states, like Oklahoma, for instance, where you have to be a registered Republican. Then you have convention states like Wyoming and Colorado. And the reason why I went through that long, boring story before I answered your question is that is what makes up our sample, and that's why it's different than a lot of the other surveys you see. If you call, and this is the way most media polls do it, they'd simply call a voter and say, are you registered Republican or Democrat? And they'll say Republican. Do you vote in the primary? Yes, which is their social desirability bias that enters into that. And so it's a very different sampling, whereas we actually talk to people who vote the way that they're supposed to vote based on the state that they're in. And that's why I think you see our numbers quite different. And what's fascinating to me as sort of a neutral observer at this point is that when you look at those people who actually vote in the way that they're supposed to vote, and I think this is why you're seeing a lot of the state polls came out. We saw it yesterday in Virginia. We've seen it in Iowa and New Hampshire, as you just alluded to, is that Ron DeSantis is opening up a fairly large lead over the former president. And I think that is likely. It's what we didn't see. I was Ted Cruz's director of polling and analytics in 2016, and we didn't see that. Once Trump built a lead, he maintained it and held it throughout the entire effort until there was a vote in the state. And he had a floor, but he also had a ceiling, and they were right next to each other. And what we're starting to see is that floor is increasingly moving lower, and it's now kind of an escalator on its way down based on what these numbers indicate.
So, Chris, what does it tell you that these national polls, as you say, they're polling sort of everyone who says they might vote in a Republican primary or caucus? They're sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall. What does it tell you that they're getting different results? Is it something that President Trump is nationally very favored, or people just say they like President Trump while voters are a little bit more focused on the process? Where do you think that difference lies?
I think it's primarily, and that's a great question. I think it really does get to the heart of the matter. It's a name identification issue. When it gets down to it, Ron DeSantis is the governor of Florida. Republican primary voters, Republican caucus goers, Republican convention goers are familiar with Ron DeSantis. But your average Republican at this point still does not know who he is outside of Florida. And so it is, I do think you have our poll is going to be, if I were on the outside looking in, I'd be critical of our poll saying, well, those are more informed voters. But I would argue that the more informed voter of today is tomorrow's more informed voter. And so we're actually giving a little bit of a preview into what's going to happen once the primaries, caucuses, conventions begin in earnest is that even if we are in our sample missing some of the people who right now might be for Donald Trump and are unfamiliar with Ron DeSantis, by the time they vote, they're going to know who all the candidates are. And that is when you go in and do a survey for instance, yes, I mentioned the Virginia survey, and I'll just point that out where Glenn Youngkin had a 16-point lead over Joe Biden in his state. So to move to the general election. Well, those are the most familiar voters in America with Glenn Youngkin. And so that's what you kind of see manifest itself. And it certainly occurred with George W. Bush in Texas. Whenever going into the 2000 election, those voters who were familiar with Bush in Texas kind of gave you a preview of what it looked like when he started to move into the early primary states because they became familiar with his record there. And so I think that's what we have. Our survey is a preview of the Republicans who are familiar with DeSantis, who have a knowledge of who he is, and also are very familiar with who Donald Trump is. Whereas the media polls that are just talking to any Republican who answers the phone, those voters are going to be far more familiar with Donald Trump because for the same reason, it's still shocking to me that we'll do a 1,000 sample survey and there'll be one person who says they don't know who Donald Trump is. And I always want to call that person up and see if it's real. But that still does happen. And so clearly, if you're going to have one person out of 1,000 who doesn't know who Donald Trump is, you're going to have a few who don't know who Ron DeSantis are.
So, Chris, you're not the first Republican to make this point, talking about the divide between these national media polls and these pollings from individual firms as well as the state level polls. But one sense I'm getting from a lot of Republicans is a lot of apprehension as to how Ron DeSantis himself will perform in terms of retail politicking in states like Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, maybe Nevada. We have seen him at a much more national level recently, going on, Newsmax, Fox News, right-leaning media. And in Florida, to his credit, during the coronavirus pandemic, and obviously as governor, he is very much out front and center. But we haven't seen him in those intimate conversations or meetings with voters. How do you think he's going to perform in that setting? And do you think that setting will be a big test for him? Because that's such an important part of primarying and campaigning in those early primary and, in Iowa's case, caucus states.
Right. Oh, no question. I mean, Iowa and Nevada are both two of the four early states, and they're both caucus states. So, no, it's absolutely essential. But I think to look at what Ron DeSantis will do, let's look at what he has done. And I think if you look at his record in Florida, where he took what was a 1% swing state for the last 20 years, every single governor's election had been won by 1%, or had won or lost by 1%. And he was able to win by double digits, the largest victory in, I think it was 38 years, I believe is what it is. But not just that, from a retail politic, and I think anyone who's critical or said they have not yet seen him as a retail politician, is you just look at where he came from. I mean, this was a man who was a member of the House of Representatives. He had to win that seat in a multi-candidate field, then had to win over a very popular ag commissioner, Adam Putnam, when he won the primary for governor. And that kind of requires a little bit of retail politicking. But then running against former Governor Charlie Crist for re-election, he wins Miami-Dade County, which is a majority Hispanic community, and he won it by double digits. And that is, I think, remarkable, and it shows the appeal he has outside of just your typical Republican base. I mean, Florida, when he took over as governor, had a net 300,000 Democrat registration. When he won as governor, had a net Republican registration of 300,000, or net Republican registration of 300,000. And so from 300,000 Democrats, to 300,000 Republican. I kind of messed that up. Today, it's 460,000. So what he has been able to do from a standpoint of turning people into Republicans and convincing them that they should become Republicans, I think translates very well into a state like, and we mentioned Nevada and Iowa are caucus states, but let's look at New Hampshire, where independents can vote. Well, if you've got a history of creating more Republicans in your own state, and some of that's obviously influx. I'm not even saying that everybody's changing registration, but a lot of it is change registration. I think that bodes well for his ability to win in states where you've got open primary systems as well.
So it's still pretty early in this cycle, and very early, and sort of the common wisdom right now, take it with a grain of salt, is that President Trump has a hold on the Republican base, and that's his strength, and that Ron DeSantis has a danger of peaking too early. Talk to me a little bit about those two elements of common wisdom, especially looking at a field that will have at least 9 candidates. Apparently, we're looking at a big field, sort of, memories of 2015. How are the two candidates going to manage this?
Well, that's really the biggest question, I think, going into this field, because I do believe a larger field of candidates helps former President Trump today. Now, it's very difficult. The thing about a poll is that it's often said it's a snapshot in time, and that's exactly right. And so it's difficult to predict what will happen as candidates get out and start campaigning. I do believe, though, that the sort of novelty appeal that Donald Trump had in 2015 and 2016 that allowed him to very quickly rocket to the top of the primary polls is dissipated. And that if, in fact, there was a media study done after the 2016 election that showed if you took all the coverage that was given to the candidates, Republican and Democrat, in the primary, that Donald Trump received somewhere around 70%. Hillary Clinton got around 15%, and the rest, like we on the Cruz campaign, got about 3%. The rest was distributed amongst all the other candidates. You're throwing Bernie Sanders, throwing everybody else in there. That's 2016. And so that really kind of went down. I mean, I think you had much more even coverage between Joe Biden and Donald Trump than you did between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And I'm not being critical of the press in this. I mean, there was a novelty appeal there. You'd never had a former businessman been elected as president. And so, and certainly not a celebrity former businessman. You know, it kind of has anytime we used to call it the full Trump if we ever got all three cable networks to cover us on the Cruz campaign. And I think it happened like 2 or 3 times. We celebrated and popped champagne. So that's not going to happen this same time. I mean, in fact, if there is a coverage deficit, I think right now, something to his own fault because he's gotten off Twitter and he's not on Facebook. You've seen President Trump's media coverage really kind of dissipate a lot from where it was in 16 and certainly 20 whenever he was running as the sitting president. And so I do think once they get out in campaign, you're going to find if you do have a multi-candidate field, they're going to get more fair coverage than I felt we received on the Cruz campaign in 2016 and 2015. And so because of that, I do think it'll be a different type of scenario. Again, though, to get right to your point, a multi-candidate field helps the former President Trump initially, but I think in the long run that that dissipates dramatically, and you'll see it become more of a lot like what happened with George W. Bush in 2000, where he was able to, he lost in Iowa, lost in New Hampshire, but then in South Carolina he was able to rebuild and kind of come back, and he kind of went on a winning streak from there. And the great thing is if you look at the way the Republican primary is structured, the South is really going to matter a lot. Super Tuesday, and all of those states happen over a course of, I mean, it's yet to be said, but if you look at the past and what's likely to occur over the course of 3 weeks to a month. And that is Ron DeSantis' base. I mean, you take Florida and expand outwards from there. That's where he is the strongest. I mean, you look at those numbers that came out of Virginia, where DeSantis again had a lead. Florida obviously has a huge lead, much even more so than Marco Rubio had in Florida. In fact, remember, he lost his own state to Trump. And so because of that, I think it is this primary, even in a multi-candidate field, probably plays out more effectively or more winnably for DeSantis with the probable exception of South Carolina. But I also think if you have 2 candidates or even just one candidate from South Carolina, you have what we call in politics the Tom Harkin effect, where when Tom Harkin, former senator from Iowa, was running for president, no one went and campaigned in Iowa. And so that's what will happen to South Carolina, I would predict, if you have 1 or 2 candidates that are still in the race when the South Carolina primary rolls around.
Well, Chris Wilson joining us from the sunny state of Florida, where there's actually a retreat or a summit, if you will, with a number of potential presidential candidates at the Club for Growth. Will be interesting to see what happens out of that. Thank you so much.
You bet. Thanks for having me. Good to see you guys.
So, Julia, there seems to be a split in the Republican Party. Chris was at the Club for Growth in Florida. You were just at CPAC here in Maryland. Why are there 2 major Republican events going on at the same time?
You know, it's a good question. I think a lot of it leads back to former President Donald Trump. Look, CPAC used to be, decades ago, going back until I think about just the Trump administration when it started, used to be a broad event. You had libertarians, you had neocons, you had, maybe more social, cultural conservatives. It was a summit of all different kinds of conservatives and Republicans. However, in recent years, it has become a very pro-Trump event. And I would say that the biggest story coming out of CPAC this year is who is not going. And that is the majority of the 2024 presidential field on the Republican side. Mike Pompeo, Nikki Haley are slated to speak today, Friday, at the time of this taping. And then Donald Trump will speak on Saturday. So an interesting, choice of venue for all of these candidates. I believe that Nikki Haley, not sure about Pompeo, but Nikki Haley was or will be at the Club for Growth event as well. So very much a split smokescreen going on in Republican Party politics.
Doing both. And I guess Governor Ron DeSantis will not be at CPAC.
He will not be at CPAC. And a lot of, CPAC attendees that my colleagues and I spoke to yesterday, didn't have necessarily anything bad to say about Ron DeSantis, but they didn't think it was his time to run. They thought this was President Trump's job to finish, which is their own words.
Well.
And that does it for us this week.
And we'll see you next time on What America's Thinking.